Hopefully the lighting is not too bad. Let's try that again. Okay, let's get rid of this. I don't need that right now. Just putting notifications on Discord. As well as on my Facebook page. Should have brought an extra cup of water. Should be okay though. Just get my whiteboard ready in case I need it. Oops. No, don't do that. Whatever, it's good enough. Put this on this side in case my brother wants it. And grab this. It's 3:05, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the book of Genesis. And today I will be reading from starting chapter, let me just check what chapter I had to start on. I'm pretty far. I'm in chapter 32. I'm starting from chapter 32. And if I go, if I manage my time properly, I should be able to get to the beginning of Joseph's story. So that's technically Joseph's story begins in chapter 37. But chapter 36 is like all genealogy, so I'll probably kind of skim that part, which kind of feels like cheap to finish the stream, but I mean, maybe that'll give you more time to prep for discussion, questions, or whatever, things you want to ask me and whatever, stuff like that. And of course, I can always do more commentary on earlier chapters. So that's the agenda for today, is to finish reading the Jacob story, if you will. And then next week we'll start with Joseph, and Joseph basically takes the rest of the book of Genesis for the most part. Of course, there are some episodes that do go back to Jacob and the other brothers, or the other sons of Jacob, I should say. Joseph's other brothers, what I meant to say, because that's normally how people think of that part of the Bible, but we'll worry about that in future weeks. So this week, the goal is to read from chapter 32 to 36. That is 5 chapters, which is a lot, but some of them I'll like kind of skim over because only like 3 of these chapters really have a lot to say, and the other 2 are kind of like whatever. So with that being said, I'm gonna start with a quick word of prayer. If you want to follow along, I am using the New International Version. I don't know why I did that because you can't see that from the cover. I'm using the New International Version. Just whip up a Bible app or BibleGateway.com. Honestly, it's just the easiest way to have access to a Bible. Why lie about it, right? So just whip up the app or something and, follow along. I'm just going to start us with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just dive right into it. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would reveal more of yourself to us and more of your desire for our lives. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Alrighty, so the preface, I guess, I will give before I start reading, just to kind of catch you guys up if you missed last week's. Basically what happened was Jacob had retreated to Padamaran, which is basically where his mom is from. His mom's home city, I guess you could say. And there he works for his uncle. And while he was working for his uncle, he basically marries his 2 cousins, Leah and Rachel. And between them and their maidservants, so basically Jacob had like 4 wives, he spawns a whole bunch of kids who will later become the 12 tribes of Israel, more or less. Because one of them doesn't become a tribe and the other one gets 2 tribes. It's kind of weird how that works, but we'll get to that later. And basically Jacob spawns a whole bunch of kids. After working for his uncle for like 20 years, he's like, all right, I'm out of here. I'm going back, to my parents in Canaan. And so he decides to take his family with him. But of course, while leaving his uncle, there is one thing waiting for him in Canaan that Jacob is not looking forward to. And it is the reason why he left in the first place, which is his older brother Esau, who Jacob rightfully believes is more than pissed off at him and might be waiting to kill him even after all this time. So, Jacob, even though he wants to return home, we'll see if he actually succeeds because, there is an angry older brother waiting for him back home. So we'll see what happens there. So this basically, at the end of chapter 31, he says, see you later, goodbye, has a more formal goodbye with his uncle. And now he's on his way back to Canaan, to his family. But of course, in that family is the older brother, which Jacob stole his birthright and his blessing. So Jacob's got himself in a pretty tight situation. So that's the preface. Let us start with chapter 32. So Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, this is the camp of God. So he named the place Mahanaim. So Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir. I think that's how you say that. The country of Edom. And Jacob instructed them, this is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there until now. I have cattle, donkeys, sheep, and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my Lord, that I may find favor in your eyes. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you with 400 men. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown me. I have only my staff when I cross this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. So Jacob spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, and 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, Go ahead of me, and keep some space between the herds. Jacob instructed the one in the lead, When my brother Esau meets you and asks, Who do you belong to, and where are you going? And who owns all these animals in front of you? Then you are to say, They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us. Jacob also instructed the second and the third servant, and all who followed the herds. You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And be sure to say, Your servant Jacob is coming behind us. For Jacob thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Then later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me. So Jacob's gifts went ahead of him, but he himself stayed night in the camp. So I'm just going to stop there for a second. The beginning of chapter 32 is pretty funny because, I mean, what else is Jacob supposed to do? Like, he does what anyone would do in his situation. So, if it wasn't already clear, basically Jacob's big plan is to buy out his brother, right? And clearly Jacob is loaded, right? Like, he's got all these, like, herd animals. So, of course, back in the ancient world, that was how you determine wealth, right? Was by all the animals you had, because you can use them for work, you can use them for food, right? And of course, you know, with all the female animals, you can breed, you can, you know, have them have kids, and then you have more wealth, right? Because that's how people grew wealth in the ancient world, right? And so, you know, Jacob. That's also why, like, the numbers, when I listed the numbers of animals, and starting from verse 13, the proportions of male and female animals is so different, right? There's like, he had like what, 200 female goats, or he had more than that, obviously. He gave his brother 200 female goats and only 20 male goats, right? So obviously, by having way more female animals to give, it was the idea that, well, they could just make more, and 20 male goats, I guess, is enough. That would just be a way to increase wealth. So that's kind of a way to understand how wealth existed in the ancient world and why those proportions exist that way. Another thing that is also not considered is that, of course, the male animals would have been used for the labor, if you will. So you can't spare all your male animals as gifts. They have to be used for, carrying the caravan, if you will. Because, of course, Jacob has young children, Joseph being one of them. So that's why the proportions of the animals is so different. There's so many more female animals that he's going to give to his brother. One, to generate wealth, and two, the male animals would have been used as laborers. But I just found it hilarious how far Jacob is willing to go. Sorry, just checking an email, work related. But basically how far Jacob is willing to go to buy out his brother. Because if you think about it, like, the amount of stuff he's willing to give his brother is basically almost all he has, right? Because, of course, the Bible doesn't clarify how much he got from his uncle or how much Jacob stole from his uncle. And so, but we know it's a lot because the 200 female goats alone would have been a lot of wealth, especially by that day's measure. I mean, even farmers to this day, if they had 200 goats to use, 200 female goats to use, that would be considered a pretty big farm. So for Jacob to just be walking around with this would have meant that he had a lot. Now, another thing to consider is that means Jacob actually had a pretty big, like, work staff, if you will. He had a lot of servants. Which the reason why I say this is because it's actually important to consider the perspective of why Esau's army is so overkill, which is kind of funny to talk about because it's one of those things the Bible just kind of gives you this intimidating number. Like by modern standards, 400 guys isn't that many, but in the ancient world, quite the opposite. A 400-man army would have been a pretty large army by that standard. So let's backtrack a bit. So Jacob probably has at least 100 servants in order to run all the animals that he has, plus other wealth because he also has, like, gold and stuff, right? He has other forms of wealth. Like, Jacob is loaded. So Jacob must have at least 100 servants. And that's maybe not at least. That would be a good number to say he does. Because to say he's got like 50 guys would be really low, right? Because to keep all his herds in check, 50 guys would not be enough. But we can't overkill it and say like Jacob has like 200 servants. Because there's no way he would have that many. So I'm going to say a safe number. Jacob would have about 100 guys. But even with 100 guys, clearly he stands no chance against his brother's army, which is why, even though by modern standards 400 guys is pretty small, in the way the Bible tells it, and of course the original audience would have been aware of this, for Esau to walk around with 400 armed fighters is kind of overkill. Because, contrary, and I've talked about this like weeks ago when I talked about another story where Abraham gets involved in like a little war. And the funny thing about these wars in the ancient world, it's not like how they depict it in movies where there's like thousands of guys in like this huge battalion. That's a much more modern thing. And when I say modern, I mean the idea of having like thousands of guys fight at a time would have been like something that happened only with like, well, Alexander the Great was actually one of the first to really pull this off, and that's one of the reasons why Alexander the Great was said to be one of the greatest conquerors, because he really, I guess, not only was he a tactical genius, but Alexander the Great was also charismatic enough to have that many guys fight for him. Because in the ancient world, that would not have been easy to do. But Alexander the Great pulled it off. But like Alexander the Great's like what? I want to say like, someone fact check this, but I think he's like roughly like 600 BC. He's maybe a little later than that. He's somewhere in that like 6 6th or 7th century BC. And Alexander the Great, he like that's compared to the book of Genesis being believed to be about, I don't know, 1500 BC, maybe a little bit earlier. Like there's a big time, like you okay, sure, in the grand scheme of things, like 1,000 years isn't that long. But, considering how much technology has changed in the ancient world, 1,000 years is a super long time. So when you think of armies, the reason why I bring this up, when you think of armies in the ancient world, you have to assume that like even a number like 400 guys is considered a massive army. Another form of perspective is like if you ever play like turn-based strategies, a favorite of mine is a game called Heroes of Might and Magic. And it's a game where you basically like, you build your castle and then you can buy like units, and instead of like they're not like individual units like in like a real-time strategy like StarCraft or something, which I play on Thursdays, so you should definitely watch that. But in a game like Heroes of Might and Magic, the armies are kind of clumped up and it's all numbers, right? So, you can have like the lower level units, you can get a large number of them, but all the stronger units, you get a smaller number of them because that's, video game balance in a nutshell. But even then, in a game like Heroes of Might and Magic, where since a lot of the combat is more numbers based, the game can allow you to build larger armies. It's not like how in StarCraft you're only allowed like a 200 food limit, which is not even 200 guys. So you're only allowed a 200 food limit, which is really a small number if you think of like modern warfare. But then even in a game like Heroes of Might and Magic, you can have like 500 infantry units. But even then, like compared to moderns, that's a small number. But of course, when you read these old stories and you read these kind of numbers that they give, and you look at the size of these armies, they're already pretty big, even though they're only in the hundreds. Because on top of that, we look at Esau's army. Esau's army is supposed to be, they're all trained fighters. So you take a average city in the world today, right? Now, I live in a place called Vancouver, British Columbia, and it has roughly, if we include all the extra cities, because, Greater Vancouver, and then, Greater Vancouver is composed of multiple cities like Vancouver, North Van, West Van, Burnaby, Surrey, etc. You put all those together and you get roughly like 2 to 3 million people, if even that. I think it's less than that actually. I think 2 million is, I'm kind of highballing it by saying like 2 million people. It's not that many. But how many people within that could we actually conscript trained fighters out of that population, right? Probably barely in the tens of thousands, right? Because remember, out of the 2 million people that live in Vancouver, how many of them are, you have to disqualify all children, because that's a war crime if you enlist children into your army like that. And then of course, you have a lot of people who simply are not fit to fight, people with like disabilities and whatever. And of course you got the weak little shits like myself, right? not warrior material, right? So you have to disqualify all of us. And then how many trained fighters do you actually have, right? Which is not that many. So you think of the ancient world where cities are not millions of people large. Excuse me. They're not millions of people large. So to even get 400 guys in one city is actually a lot of guys. Just to put that in perspective. But of course the contrast is, and this is one of the big differences when you think of how industrialization, even though in the ancient world that's not what this is, but the big difference between like a nomadic tribe, like Jacob's would be, and an actual city in the ancient world, right? Because even though cities in the ancient world are like, only a little bit bigger than like a small town today, these cities, they only have so many guys in it. So how many of them can become professional, warriors, right? Warrior, being a soldier as your job, right? Not that many. But it's also kind of funny where the contrast between a city and a nomadic tribe is that, a city's military force is kind of overkill when you're dealing with a nomadic tribe. So Jacob is only traveling with like what? Just over 100 guys, including himself and his family. So they would probably sum up to a total of 100 guys. But not all of them are trained fighters. Heck, probably only like 10 to 20 of them could fight, and assuming they could fight on the level of an actual soldier. And then of course, you have Esau, who himself is a warrior, because, the Bible has portrayed him as like he's very, on his feet and works with his hands. So if he were a fighter, he'd clearly be a more than competent one. But you got to put that in perspective of why Jacob would be so afraid, right? Because you think, well, 400 guys can't be that many, but it's like, well, you're a small nomadic tribe. Most of you don't know how to fight, and now 400 armed guys are coming toward you. Like, Jacob knows he's, deader than dead. So this kind of completely justifies why Jacob's big plan is to buy out his brother, because he's like, please don't kill us. we'll give you all this stuff, right? We'll give you all this stuff. Please don't kill us, right? And so it's just kind of funny where, that's Jacob's big plan. And one of the things to think about is, and relating this to us as modern people, that's kind of how we feel when we've done something wrong to someone and we think we can just buy them out, right? To bribe people. I mean, that's why, there's this whole problem of people, the stereotype of cops being bribed, right? And the idea that we can just buy people out when we get ourselves in trouble. Because if you can't lie your way out, you're going to bribe your way out, right? And so, this is something that, I don't know, just to really consider about how we live as people and the danger of having to deal with the wrongs we've done in the past, right? But of course, what we later learn is that, you can't just buy out your way out of everything, right? Because, I mean, money can only get you so far. But hey, Jacob thinks it's going to work, so we're going to see how this pans out for the guy. Okay. That was a lot to talk about for the first part of chapter 32. Because the second part of chapter 32 has even more to talk about, and it's actually less text. So, let's read the second part of chapter 32, starting from verse 22. So, 32:22 is what we're reading right now. So that night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob replied, "Please tell me your name." But the man replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel. And the reason why he named it that was, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet I was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So that's the end of chapter 32. And this part here, from verse 22 to the end of chapter 32, you've probably heard this story a lot of times, especially from Sunday school. It's like a popular one in Sunday school, is to talk about this part of Jacob's journey. And it's the part where, well, mainly because God actually interacts with him. Now, something I didn't really talk about when I was talking about the Isaac and Rebecca arc, and something that's kind of interesting in Genesis. I mean, I've kind of referenced it a couple of times, but I never went about it in great detail. Was that Isaac, oddly enough, did not have a lot of interactions with God. Because, you know, when I talked about the Abraham story, Abraham hangs out with God like all the time, right? Like, God kind of just comes to Abraham's house from time to time. It's just like, yo, man, let's hang out. And, you know, God builds like multiple covenants with him. And, you know, Abraham gives God milk and cheese. Or, sorry, meat and cheese, right? Milk and cheese. Meat and cheese. You know, like with Abraham, Abraham has so many interactions with God. But then Isaac kind of has this blank moment, right? Like there's really not a lot of interaction between Isaac and God. And then we get to Jacob, and Jacob has a very interesting relationship with God, right? Because unlike Abraham, see, Abraham had that whole like homeboy relationship with God, where, you know, God treats Abraham like his friend, right? But with Jacob, it's a very different kind of relationship. So on the one hand, you know, God acts kind of more like an authority figure, similar to how Abraham's journey begins, right? You know, God tells him, do this, right? And then Abraham and Jacob in the same case is like, okay, yeah, I'll do it, right? And then later on, though, unlike Abraham, Jacob's relationship with God is very different. So Abraham gets the whole buddy-buddy thing with God. But with Jacob, Jacob has to, for some reason, Jacob like has this kind of prove myself relationship. So it's more like a, how do I put this? Jacob's relationship with God is more like the child who tries to win his parents' approval, right? Which is a tough relationship. And that's where a lot of people get this idea that, like, you know, God is more distant and God is more like that strict authority, right? And you look at Jacob's relationship with God, and that's something you can easily think that, you know, Jacob has to prove himself to God, which is ridiculous, right? Because, I mean, every Christian will tell you nobody can do that. But this is kind of the relationship that Jacob has with God, right? That he has to prove himself. But of course, we read the earlier parts of Jacob's life, and, you know, we're kind of like, there's no way Jacob could prove himself toward God, right? Like, he's a schemer, you know, he's a filthy liar, he's, you know, polygamous, you know, kind of womanizer in that sense, though not entirely his fault, right? And of course, we just read that Jacob is also like, well, part of the whole schemer thing is that he thinks he can just he can buy his way out of stuff, right? That he doesn't have to face his problems. And so Jacob does not have a great track record, right? As definitely when it comes to proving himself to God, right? Jacob isn't doing a very good job in that regard. But of course, this is where this popular story comes in, and it's very important to see this. That, you know, God and Jacob wrestle. And we know that this is God because of the name that the man gives to Jacob. Which, well, I'll take this little story step by step. I don't want to jump around too much. So let's take the story step by step. So first, Jacob does the tactical thing, right? This is Jacob trying to prove himself, if you will, to his family. And so he sends his family, across the river and has them go ahead. And so Jacob sits there and he meditates for a while, I guess is what he's doing. Because, to be fair, Jacob is so scared of his brother, right? Like, he's probably thinking like, oh my god, like why is my brother walking around with 400 armed guys? Like, this isn't just gonna be me getting killed. It's gonna be like me getting slaughtered so brutally they can't air it on TV, like that bad, right? Like, there's no reason to bring 400 guys. If you were gonna kill me, you probably only need like 20 guys, and you could just kill me with your bare hands yourself, right? Like like that's probably what Jacob's thinking, right? Like, he's so scared of his brother. And of course, Jacob also is thinking about like, I probably had this coming all this time too, right? Because all the stuff I did in the past. So Jacob is meditating. He's probably playing out all the scenarios in his head. And then of course the Bible does this weird thing where it kind of just like, there's a big event that happens, but the Bible just throws it away in like one sentence, which is kind of, one of those things that the Bible does. And I know it can be it's a little annoying to read. But of course, you kind of have to take the idea that if this were a story told orally, and of course, an orator would have the audience imagine a lot of the story. So that's one of the things you have to do when it comes to, reading this story. You have to imagine a lot of what's happening. And so the Bible says, okay, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. So it's just like, what the heck happened? Like, so Jacob's just meditating, and this dude just shows up. And of course since the Bible tells us it's nighttime, I guess the assumption is that like, well, a dude walks up to you in the middle of the night, and what's the first thing you're gonna do, right? You're gonna fight this guy because you don't know what's gonna happen, right? You don't know who this guy is. Understandable, right? So it's kind of funny where like the scenario seems ridiculous, but at the same time, like, especially as modern readers, like, it makes total sense, right? Random ass dude walks up to you in the middle of the night. What's the first thing you're gonna do, right? The first thing you're gonna do is, to fight this guy off, right? Or run away. That's one of the two options, right? But I mean, if Jacob tried running, I assume the guy might have overtaken him. So fighting might be a pretty good response, right? Just end it there, right? So that's probably what happens, and of course they fight until daybreak. So of course the Bible's not necessarily clear how long this is, because we don't know like whether Jacob started fighting this guy at like 3 a.m. or if it was like only an hour. So like maybe he saw the guy at 5 a.m. and then 6 a.m. The sun came up, right? We don't know that. The Bible doesn't really tell us that. What we do know is that the person appears in the blackness of night, which is enough reason why you would be suspicious of anyone, approaching you in the dead of night. And so I'm just trying to rationalize this kind of ridiculous scenario, right? Jacob just fighting this guy all night, basically. And then, of course, funny parts in the story start happening. So apparently, this man could not out wrestle or whatever Jacob. Jacob somehow gets the upper hand on this man. Of course, one of the weird things to read about, especially since this is the Bible and all that. Of course, we know that this is supposedly God based on later texts. But with that being said, it does seem kind of absurd that like, how does a regular guy like Jacob beat God in a wrestling match? Which sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, right? But I think there's some kind of point, there's a point being proven here. And we'll get to that in a moment. So, story continues. Jacob fights this guy. And then when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. Now, different Bible translations use different words for this, like whether he actually hit him there or if it was just like a pat there or something. The Bible's not really clear because different translations. But of course, the Hebrew is just like a make contact, right? So we don't know if that's like he actually hit him there or if it was, just a pat or whatever, right? Because making contact can mean all kinds of things, right? But making contact with Jacob's hip, and then he dislocates it. And of course, when the NIV uses the word like touch, there's that more supernatural element, right? That, he just touched him there like a simple pat, and then, with God's magical powers or whatever, he dislocated his leg without any real trouble. He didn't have to actually hit him to do it, which is more often the interpretation that's taken because of that word choice, that, the person touched him. And so I think the reason for this word choosing is, one, to also reinforce the idea that this is not a mere man, right? That this is in fact God that Jacob is wrestling with. Because I mean, if a guy could strike you and break your leg, I mean, a lot of mortal men can do that, right? But not anybody can just like give you a pat on the leg and then all of a sudden your leg is broken, right? So I think that's the reasoning for that word choice, especially when the NIV uses it that way. So the guy dislocates his leg, but then Jacob still has two strong arms, so I guess he's using his arms to like maybe pin the guy or something. And this is where Jacob tries to bargain with this guy in the most ridiculous way possible, right? Because he's like, the guy's like, all right, this fight's over, like let go of me, right? And Jacob's like, no, like I won't let go until you bless me. So basically, Jacob, in a funny way, Jacob is violating all wrestling rules right here, because usually when a guy calls uncle, that means you have to let go, but Jacob refuses. But maybe because he wasn't the man wasn't saying uncle exactly, but he is trying to give up by saying like fight's over, like let go of me, right? And so in a way, this man is conceding, which is interesting that he does this. The man, the man magically just dislocated his leg. You would think that he would just do that the same to the rest of his body if he wanted to, right? But he doesn't. Instead, he only settles for the leg and then decides, hey man, I actually concede this fight, all right? Like this fight's over. I give up, all right? Now let go of me. But, Jacob says, bless me, which is a very odd request to ask a stranger that you probably assumed was trying to kill you like a couple of hours ago. I mean, why else were they fighting for so long, right? It's only fair to assume that Jacob assumed that this mysterious person was going to kill him. And I mean, to be fair, Jacob would be in every right to think this. Because, I mean, the reason why Jacob is meditating alone is because he's thinking about all the worst case scenarios of what's going to happen when he encounters his brother. So it's kind of funny where Jacob has this request from a guy who could possibly be an assassin or something, for all he knows, right? And he asks this assassin to bless him. Then comes the big part, the climax of Jacob's journey. And that is the name change. So the man says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Now this text is a very interesting text, because that is the most ridiculous thing for someone to be called. Because one, is it actually possible? And two, that is not a name you want to be, paraded around in, right? Because then Everybody will want a piece of you then, right? But here, the man calls him Israel, and that name means he who wrestles with God and has overcome. Now, that second part is very interesting, right? That somehow a man overcomes God. Of course, this wording has a lot of different meaning to it, right? Because does that mean like as she defeats God? Because that's one way to interpret that word. But, as I suggested earlier, I think it has a lot to do with proving yourself to God, right? And it's one of those things that, depending on who you ask in the Christian world, you'll get very different answers. And this is where, the reason why some people don't take Christianity seriously at times, and I don't blame them. But, here, when God gives Jacob the name Israel, there's this idea that like you have proven yourself to God, right? That is actually a thing that humans can and must do. But of course, there's a lot of people who would say, well, no, you don't have to prove yourself to God at all, because God gives free forgiveness, which is also true. Well, at least that second part. But what I think is going on here is that there's the strive for some kind of relationship with God. And I think that's what God was doing with this fight with Jacob. Because one of the issues, we can go back with Abraham's story, in that it took Abraham so long to learn something from God. And that might have been because God went too easy on him. I think that's one way to read the Abraham story. And one of the dangers of, us as modern Christians to think, well, God, my relationship with God, I can, it can be easy. But that's, if the Garden of Eden says anything, that's not a particularly healthy route to go. Because if your relationship with God is so easy, then it's also easy to fall out of, which is what happened to Adam and Eve. And of course, with Abraham, it took Abraham a long time to learn anything from God, because his relationship with God was so easy. But with Jacob, since the relationship was so hard, perhaps there was more to get out of it, especially in Jacob's case. And you'll see fruits of that in the next chapter. But this is, I think, what the Bible wanted to establish as early as Genesis, about how human beings are meant to interact with God. That there's meant to be this struggle in our relationship with God, because to relate to God is not meant to be easy. It was never meant to be. And so, with a name like Israel, you have overcome that obstacle. The obstacle of, well, my relationship with God, it can be like secondary, or it can be something that I take lightly. But at the same time, the central Christian message is, no, it's not that easy, right? And many of the New Testament writers knew this, because that's why they refer, to the church as the new Israel. And it's the idea that our relationship with God is meant to be a struggle. And that's why in like the book of James, for example, I was doing my devotionals in the book of James. And because the book of James is a great book to do your devotionals in, over and over. Because the book of James is just so full of practical wisdom. But there's a part where in the book of James, it talks about how, as the new Israel, right, we are called to continuously, fully put our lives and commit it to God, right? And it ain't easy, right? You're going to come with all these obstacles in the way. I mean, that's essentially the main point of chapter 4 in the book of James, is because, like, you want wisdom, it comes at a high price, right? Sure, you can ask God for it, but then of course, God is going to call, he's going to call you up, to actually live it, right? You don't just get it for free, right? Or rather, sure, God will give it to you for free, but at the same time, you gotta use it right. That's a better way of wording it, I think. And it's true here with Jacob, right? That if he wanted something, he had to fight for it. He couldn't just go the easy route, which is, when you read this, Jacob wrestles with the with God's story. It's contrast to the earlier part of the chapter where Jacob's plan was to buy out his brother. But here it's like, no, it's not going to be that easy, right? You'll have to fight for it. You have to fight for what matters. And of course, in the grand scheme of things, your relationship with God is the ultimate thing that matters. And that means you're going to have to fight really hard for it. You're going to fight, fang and claw for it. And it ain't going to be easy. But at the same time, to overcome, yourself and have that relationship with God, which I think is what's really going on when God calls him Israel, right? That you have wrestled with God and have overcome, right? That you've overcome the obstacles and that you will have what ultimately matters. And so that's how we overcome, wrestling with God, and that we come to what ultimately matters, which is our relationship with God, because that's ultimately what matters. And you have to overcome all the obstacles, which is something Jacob had to learn the hard way, clearly. And so I think that's why this story is so important. Of course, that's also where why they're called that, right? Because they are a people that has fought with God. And of course, you read through the rest of the Bible, and Israel has to wrestle with God over and over. More often than not, they lose because, people don't repent. But that is a struggle. It's a continual struggle. And that's another thing that's often forgotten about when we talk about faith life, right? That it's a continual wrestling with God. You don't just fight God once, if that makes sense. But it is something that we continuously have to do. Continuing on the text, Jacob asks a rhetorical question and says, "What is your name?" as he says to the man. And the man coyly responds, Why do you ask that? Now, of course, a lot of people go, well, why does this man act so rhetorical in that, right? He doesn't give him a real answer. But that's because Jacob's question is rhetorical. And what I mean by that is the answer is meant to be so obvious, you shouldn't have to give an answer because the answer is already there. Because after that whole thing about explaining the name of Israel, right? In a way, the man gave his name. And this is important as well. Because this is the this is the apex, if you will, of the covenant. Now here's the big idea, I guess, in the patriarch's story, right? Between Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. And I made this claim, my hot take, if you will, was that in a way Jacob is the real founder of Israel. And I mean, the name thing is the big giveaway, right? Is the dead giveaway about how Jacob is actually the true founder of the people of Israel. And it is because of this event that establishes how it's going to be between God and people, right? And in a way, a fulfillment of the covenant that God had set up with Abraham, as early as with Abraham. And God continues that covenant, all the way to the New Testament, right? And so this story, and I think it's a reason why everybody should know this story well. And you also have to know the rest of chapter 32, where Jacob says about his brother. And of course, chapter 33, which I will read soon. You really got to understand, the context around it too, to really understand the Jacob wrestles with God story. Because I believe it's a story everybody should know. And it's a really important thing for, especially Christians, to understand how your faith life is meant to work. So, my little analysis of the whole Israel thing, and this covenant thing I was getting at is that when the man, which I will now refer to him as God, when God gives Jacob this name, Israel, right? And how the name Israel has that whole, you have wrestled with God and with humans and have prevailed. There's this covenant idea within that because, how do I put it? God ties himself to his identity, which is a weird thing to do, right? God ties himself to a human being's identity. And in a weird way, that's sort of how the covenant ends up evolving, for lack of better words, right? The covenant that God started with Abraham, that Abraham will bless that God will bless Abraham and, all people through his lineage, right? And so there's this apex moment here where God is saying, before we did it, with animals and stuff like that. But in order to transcend, like a covenant with one guy and to continuously do animal covenants, if you will, the splitting of animals and all that. And instead of like God doing that with every single patriarch, he does it through a people's name, if that makes sense. He ties the contract to a group, to an identity. And that's why the name Israel is so important. Because God is saying that as long as there is an Israel, I will always have that. My identity will always be tied to you, which is a bold move for God to make, right? Because the easy way of thinking about it is like, well, why would God want to tie himself with human beings, right? Human beings are crap, but it shows that God is faithful. The name Israel also shows that God is faithful because he has tied himself to human beings. He won't break his covenant, right? Because now he has kind of made it in this weird, convoluted way of through God will do whatever in his power, for the betterment of humanity, right? Which ultimately culminates in the person of Jesus Christ. But let's not jump that far in the future. But with the name of Israel is meant to be that establishment of like, my covenant will always continue. And as long as that name exists, that covenant will be upheld. God will uphold that covenant because of that name. Because God has tied himself to human beings with the name of Israel. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about this story that is often undermined. Or I shouldn't say undermined, but clearly not explained very well. And it's one of those things that every Jewish person is kind of trained to really think this, right? If you go to any rabbi and they'll tell you this, which is actually where I got a lot of this actually, was understanding why rabbis are, much more, understanding the grammar, the Hebrew grammar, and how rabbis interpret that word Israel. And I think it's something that modern Christians tend to forget, because we tend to kind of revert back to that more Abraham and God relationship of that whole like Jesus my homeboy kind of thing, which is not untrue. But at the same time, I think there is that wrestling with God and that identity tie, right? And once again, in the New Testament, there's that whole language, especially in the book of Hebrews, and the book of James uses it a little bit, where it's like we're the new Israel, right? And it's the idea that God ties his identity with human beings. And of course, in Christianity, it's supposed to be like a hadar with the whole, sharing in the blood of Jesus. And of course, that's why the Eucharist exists, right? That's the main reason why the Eucharist exists, is to remember that God has tied his identity with human beings in, dying for human beings and cleansing us of sin. And so the significance of that name, Israel, it's something that's often forgotten and is often undermined. And I think it's something that, we really need to embrace more, because that will help us grow in how seriously we take our relationship with God, that our relationship with God is a big deal. And I think that's one of the things that, like, how do I put this? You should treat your relationship with God extremely seriously, because according to this, clearly God takes his relationship with human beings pretty seriously if he's willing to tie his name, or to tie his identity to a human name. Because one of those other things too, which some people may call out contradiction in the Bible, and we might as well address it, is where, God talks about how you don't associate him with earthly things, right? That's the whole, like, don't make idols, right? You don't, the whole don't make idols commandment. You don't tie God and his identity to things of nature. But at the same time, here, God ties himself to human identity. And that is the whole, like, the power of a name thing, kind of thing. And so it's because God is willing to do that, it shows that God is dead serious about, like, how much he wants to have a relationship with human beings, and all the more reason why we should not take our relationship with God lightly. Which is why why God in this passage, he kind of treats Jacob's question like it's a stupid question. But he's like, well, why do you ask me for my name? And the answer that's given in the word Israel is that I've already given you my name, because I've tied it with yours, right? That's kind of that's what this man was getting at when he answers Jacob in that way. He's like, that's a stupid question. Our names are intertwined. And then, of course, that's when Jacob gets the revelation, right? And that's why he names the place that they're at Peniel, which means I saw God face to face. Wow, I skipped a word there. And my life was spared. Because Jacob understood this. He said, wow, like, I've encountered God, and somehow I'm still here. And so, Jacob understood this, and this begins the people of Israel, if you will, because God's identity is now tied with human beings, which reinforces the covenant, right? Because we read earlier about how Jacob is trying to recall, the promise God gave him, right? Jacob's thinking like, well, you said you were going to make my descendants like the sea of the grains of sand, right? How is that going to happen? My brother's going to kill me in the next 24 hours, right? That's probably what Jacob's thinking. And God says, no, that's not going to happen, because I've tied my name to yours. So I will uphold that, right? Then to end chapter 32, the Bible does kind of like a fable thing where it's just like, and this is why, you know, there's certain things that happen today. So the funny little fable moment is like, therefore to this day, the Israelites do not eat tendons attached to the socket of the hip because of this story. It's like, okay. I mean, to us modern readers, that's probably how we treat it. We're like, okay, it's just an interesting fable bit there that has nothing to do with anything. But it must have been just part of, like, the Israeli culture to not eat certain parts of an animal, and they're like, well, this is why we don't do it, right? So anyway, that's chapter 32. And I just realized I've been, like, talking about this one chapter for like almost an hour. So we got to speed run the rest of this. But don't worry. After chapter 33, we actually move pretty quickly. Okay, I was wrong. After chapter 34, we'll move through pretty quickly. So we got 2 long chapters to talk about. So I'm going to stop wasting time and start reading chapter 33. I gotta sit up better. Drinking that whole iced coffee might not have been the smartest idea. Because now I kind of have this feeling I have to go to the bathroom. Which I might do halfway. I might do like after I reach chapter 33. So let's do this. Chapter 33. So Jacob looked up, and there was Esau, coming with his 400 men. So he divided his children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants, because I guess they're not important enough to name. He put the female servant, well, I mean, we know their names, but the Bible doesn't feel like to repeat them, I guess. So he put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. Jacob himself went on ahead and bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" "They are my children. God has graciously given your servant." Then the female servants of their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. And lastly came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. They too bowed down. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I've met?" "To find favor in your eyes, my lord." "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please. If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God. Now that you have received me favorably, please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me and I have all that I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, Let us be on our way, and I'll accompany you." "My lord knows that the children are tender, and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all the animals will die. So let my lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me, and the pace of the children, until I come to my lord in Seir." "Then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why do that? Just let me find favor in the eyes of my lord." So that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock, and that is why the place is called Succoth. So after Jacob came from Paddan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan, and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it El Elohi Israel, which apparently means El is the God of Israel, or Mighty is the God of Israel. One of those funny names that people attribute to God because, El is that word that's traditionally used in place of the name of God. So that's chapter 33. Now, chapter 33 is a funny twist because, in chapter 32, Jacob's whole worry is that, Esau out to kill him. But, of course, the complete opposite happens, right? So Esau, Jacob's like ready for the worst. And instead, Esau hugs him and embraces him and is super forgiving. And Esau's kind of let it all go, right? He doesn't care anymore. He's obviously over the whole stealing birthright and blessing thing. Which I know on the one hand, we might think, well, he should get over after 20 years. But one of the ironic things that the Bible will point out is that even though in the Genesis story Esau is super forgiving, when we read of the Israelites' adventures in the book of Exodus and in Numbers, the Edomites, who are supposedly like the descendants of Esau, are not very nice people, right? They're when the Israelites try to pass through the land of Edom in the book of Numbers, I think it is, the Edomites are like super aggressive, and they're like, "No, you step foot here, you dead." And so it's interesting that the Bible does this like complete reversal of that idea, because there's clearly a parallel between Genesis 32 and 33 and the story in Numbers. I should remember which chapter it is actually. I'm too lazy to look it up. Somebody fact check it. But basically, there's meant to be this parallel, right? That the Israelites try to come in peace and they try to buy their way out. But with the Edomites in Numbers, the Edomites are like, no, like, get out of here. Whereas Esau is super forgiving. And that's very interesting to see. Now, this is more of my theory than anything. So take this with like a couple of grains of salt. But perhaps what Genesis is trying to do is trying to teach the people of Israel not to hold grudges. Even though they may encounter people, especially during the 40 years in the wilderness, the Israelites would meet a lot of people that they're going to hate them. But even if you have to fight these people, you should never hold grudges and think badly of other people, even if they're your enemies. And I think this Genesis story was meant to teach Israel that. And of course, the book of Genesis does it in an ironic way, because the book of Genesis loves doing that, I guess. Lots of things in Genesis are done in an ironic fashion. Cain and Abel is a good example. And Jacob and Esau is another good example. It's kind of done in an ironic way, right? It's the Edomite who's the forgiving one and doesn't hold a grudge. Unlike Jacob / Israel, who clearly, lives in the past, right? He's thinking all the worst case scenarios because he thinks his brother lives in the past like he does. But clearly it's Jacob who's living in the past. And Esau's kind of like, whatever, bygones be bygones. I'm super rich now, so who cares, right? I'm super rich now, so I don't care about the past, right? I just live for today. That's kind of Esau's attitude. And so Esau has moved on, which is ironic, right? Because if the lesson is to teach Israel, the people, don't live in the past, don't hold grudges, you would think that when you tell a story, you would make the Israelite do that. You wouldn't make the enemy do that, right? And so it's funny that the Genesis story does this. It does it in an ironic way and reverses the roles of who's the one who can let go, right? The one who can let go, ironically, is not the Israelite in this story. Which, of course, the Bible does this a lot, right? Because I talked about how with Abraham's adventures, it's the Philistine and the Egyptian who are the righteous people in those stories, and then it's Abraham who's the filthy liar, right? And then because you would think in most stories, and especially for propaganda, you portray your own character as the good guy, right? Because if the Bible wanted to be a lot more wanted to be more propaganda, it would make Jacob the one who's forgiving. But no, the Bible does the opposite. The Bible makes Esau the one who's forgiving. Right? Esau lets it go and says, you know what, I have what I need. I'm more than rich enough. I mean, I got 400 guys who would throw their lives down for me. Like I'm pretty rich, all right? Like you don't have to give me anything. But of course, eventually Jacob does convince his brother to take it because Esau's probably like, all right, I'm tired of arguing with you. I'll just take your stuff then if you're so insistent on it. Which is kind of funny that Esau, complies in that regard. So I think that's an important thing to catch on when you're reading through Genesis, is how more often than not, the Bible ironically makes the non-Jewish people, I'll use that more modern language, the non-Jewish people are the ones who are portrayed as good people. Even though the idea is that the Jews are the one who get to encounter, God, but yet God uses non-Jews as good people in the stories. It's ironic, right? And here's my hot take of the week, if you will, because the other one was kind of like a hot take over the weeks, if you will. But this is my hot take of the week. This is how you know, in a way, that the Bible had to be more than human inspired. Because you hear lots of people make the argument that, well, the Bible is just made up, just like any other story. But for the Bible to do this would be counterintuitive of that, right? Because you can't view the book, at least in the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis would clearly not be a propaganda story for the Israelites to rally themselves behind, right? Because more often than not, the Israelites are the bad guys, and of course, I think there's another irony that's going on here too, because if you parallel this with Exodus and Numbers, which you have to read the Torah as one whole, that also makes way more sense, right? Because you read in Exodus and in Numbers, the Israelites are not very good people. They're a bunch of whiny little bitches most of the time. They're always complaining to Moses about this or that, right? And they're always like, oh, why don't we go back to Egypt? Why don't we whatever, right? Oh, Moses, you led us out here to die in the desert. They're just whiny the whole time. And so Israel, the people that supposedly have this identity tied with God, and this is the other ironic thing about it, right? And once again, it's this idea that it's hard to really think about how could the Bible solely be propaganda when it does the opposite of what propaganda should do, where the main protagonist, if you will, the human protagonist anyways, because once again, the Bible is more about how good God is than it is about human beings. But of course, one of the main themes you run into the Bible over and over is that human beings are actually pretty crappy, right? And of course, the reason for the irony in a lot of the Genesis stories and even other stories in the Bible, in other books, is to remind people that it's all human beings, right, are, it's the reason why everybody, doesn't matter who you are, needs God, right? And even Israel, the chosen people, the people who have their name tied with God himself, even the Israelites are crappy people because everybody's crap, right? And only God is good. And that's where, a lot of these other statements about, that the Bible uses, that, when Jesus says only God is good, which is based on the prophet saying only God is good, because even the human protagonists, the Israelites, are actually pretty terrible. And to be fair, when you read the Jacob story, it's like, well, duh, right? Because Jacob is pretty awful. And the story ironically makes his brother the good guy, right? The brother who got cheated out twice, right? And his brother is the good guy. And so it's meant, this irony reinforces the idea that, well, clearly the Bible is not this propaganda script that a lot of people would claim it is, because the Bible does a lot of things to make itself not propaganda. And from a fair criticism, right? I know, heretical speech coming, right? You would think that, well, the Bible is just shooting itself in the foot in a lot of ways, right? If you're gonna be that critical about what the Bible does here if you just take it from a literary sense, right? And not a theological one. Because theologically, there's a reason for this, as I just explained, right? It's to give the idea that this is actually God inspired. Because no human being would write themselves in this really terrible way, right? No human being would do that to themselves. I mean, you think of anyone's autobiography, and most people write themselves in pretty positive light, even if they did bad things. But, you know, the Bible is about how good God is. And so, which I guess in that way, you could say that, well, see, this is where it gets kind of weird and convoluted, where it's like, God used human writers to write how great he was, but at the same time, he made the human writers, made sure that the human writers look bad. It's kind of weird to think of it that way, but it's just the way it is. And so, going back, let's backtrack a bit and go on the literary, just reading the Bible on a literary level. It would make sense for people to think, well, why does the Bible shoot itself in the foot like this then, to make, you know, the Israelites look so terrible? And more often than not, you know, the Bible is very clever about how it does this, right? It doesn't just outright say that, like, man, we Israelites are just so terrible, right? Because the Bible doesn't outright do that. But instead, it uses this genius use of irony. And I mean, that's basically the book of Genesis in a nutshell. It's just continual ironic stories. Everything's ironic in the book of Genesis. Which I guess it's one of those another thing too, that because everything is ironic in Genesis, it's kind of hard to believe a lot of stuff going on in Genesis, which is a fair criticism that some literary critics have. It's like, well, the Bible is so ridiculous in how ironic it is. Everything's ironic. So how can it be believable then? But of course, at the same time, people who made those criticisms have never met human beings, right? Because I think it speaks a lot about the human condition in that way too, that human beings are just full of, you know, ironic moments. We do things and then we kind of contradict ourselves, but at the same time it makes complete sense. And sure, there's that thin line between like our lives are ironic and then of course like intentionally doing it, which is hypocritical. But even the best of people, their lives are just so full of this like double nature, if you will, because that's human lives in a nutshell, right? Every human being is so double natured, and it's kind of played off in the narrative sense as like, well, every life is ironic, right? But at the same time, there's a beauty in that too, that shows that we're real human beings and we have real struggles. And that's all the more reason, if you will, that we need, you know, God to help us and to carry us in our day-to-day lives. Because I mean, left to our own devices, we would just be going back and forth, never being sure about anything, because that's human beings in a nutshell. Not much else to say about chapter 33, because I mean, chapter 33 is just mainly about that exchange between Jacob and Esau. But I just really wanted to point out like how ironic the story is, especially when, like, you know, God just tied his identity to Israel, but at the same time Israel's like kind of seen as super petty. Hello, Mischief. Israel is seen as like super petty, and I will refer to Jacob from now on as Israel, just because I mean that's kind of how the narrative does it too, so it's only fair to be consistent with that. But you know, Jacob is, or Israel is kind of, wow, I totally just see, ironic. Um, but Israel is, he's not the best guy to build your identity on, but at the same time, you know, he's also a symbol of how human beings generally are. And so I think that's another good reason for everybody to kind of understand the Jacob story. There's nothing else to really say about chapter 33. I think I said everything that's important. And look at my notes here. Yep. That's all I wanted to say about chapter 33. Okay. I'm going to take a short break because my bladder is killing me, because having that whole iced coffee to myself was not a good idea. Because, I don't know, drinking a whole cup of coffee like that makes you really need to go to the bathroom. So I'll be right back. And you can stare at this cool image, I guess, that I use for everything. Where is it? Here. Oops. It's that weird blackness in the background. There you go. No cat. And mute the microphone too. Move the anime picture a little bit. Let's put her on screen. There you go. Oops. Nope, less of me. There you go. Had to fix that. Oh, alright, I'm back. Sorry about that. But that's what happens when you drink a whole iced coffee to yourself, I guess. Now you're probably wondering, why would I be drinking an iced coffee? It's like almost December, and you live in Canada where it's super cold. That's what this blanket is for, one. And two, because iced coffee is like my guilty pleasure. And of course I do this thing where, like, when my mom makes a cup of coffee for herself in the morning, there's always like a little bit left in the pot. And to make sure I don't waste it, what I do is I pour those into like a bottle, and when the bottle's full, I use it, and then I make myself an iced coffee out of it. So today was the day where the bottle was full. I was like, you know what, I'm gonna drink it. So I make it into like an iced coffee. You just put in some brown sugar and a little bit of almond milk, because I have to use almond milk because don't want to have too don't want to have too much lactose. So anyway, enough of that. All right, break over. Just gotta my mind of it, because I did spew you a lot of information. Don't hesitate to ask questions, because I know I spew a lot of information at times, and it can be overwhelming. I know that, because, I mean, you ever see me use a whiteboard, like in my stream last week or the week before that? Like, my mind can be in like 10,000 places at once. So if you have questions to clarify stuff, don't hesitate. And I'll do my best to answer those questions. But, I mean, anytime I answer any question, I do give long answers because I'm like that. Okay. Continuing on to chapter 34, and this one is a doozy. Chapter 34. Now Dinah, the daughter Leah had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. When Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler of that area, he saw her, he took her, and R-word her. Because I'm not going to actually read it. I might get in trouble for actually saying the word. But you know what I mean. I mean, just read it yourself. That's why you should have the Bible thing open. Use the Bible app or BibleGateway.com as for simplicity purposes. He did the R-word to her. His heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. Shechem loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her, which is really messed up if you think about it. And Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Give me this girl as my wife." Now when Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the field with the livestock, so he did nothing about it till he came home. When Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk to Jacob, meanwhile Jacob's sons had come in from the fields as soon as they heard what had happened. They were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. But Hamor said to them, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife. Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us, for the land is open to you. Live in it, trade in it, and acquire property in it." Then Shechem said to Dinah's father and brothers, Let me find favor in your eyes. I'm not doing voice acting today. I don't know, it's just not crossing my mind very well. Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for the bride and the gift I am to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask me. Only give me the young woman as my wife. Because Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. And they said to them, "We can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into an agreement with you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you. But if you will not agree to be circumcised, we will take our sister and go." Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem, the young man who was the most honored of all his family. So they lost no time in doing what they said, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gate of their city to speak with the men of their city. These men are friendly toward us. Let them live in our land and trade in it. The land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters and they can marry ours. But the men will agree to live with us as one people on the condition that our males be circumcised as they themselves are. Won't their livestock, their property, and all their other animals become ours? So let us agree to their terms, and they will settle with us. All the men who went out at the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble to me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they replied, Should we have treated our sister like a prostitute? So yeah, chapter 34 is a wild interlude. And now that I think about it, a good reason why to take that bathroom break. Because, oh boy, there's a lot to unpack here. So, the story begins, I forgot to kind of mention, because I didn't feel it was like too important, because it's more important to this chapter than it was in chapter 33, where how Jacob doesn't actually go with his brother all the way to, what's the place called? Seir, but instead like stops most of the way there in this other town called Succoth. And you know, it's one of those funny things where what would have happened if Jacob had actually just settled with his brother for a while instead of, deciding not to do that? Because Jacob ends up in kind of putting himself in a pickle here. Or Israel, I guess. But I guess they haven't grown to the people of Israel yet. So the story begins with this town, and Dinah, the only girl mentioned out of all Jacob's children, because we don't know if he had more girls. We just know about all the boys that he had. But the one girl ends up, getting defiled, and through forceful, sex. And then, this whole thing kind of just goes all over the place, right? So Dinah's brothers, because Dinah has a whole bunch of brothers, right? She has like 6 brothers. And 2 of them are kind of put on center stage. But in a way, I mean, there's a reason for that, which we won't go into until basically the very last chapter in Genesis. But basically, since I don't want to jump to chapter 49, I think it is, where Israel himself points out that Simeon and Levi are potentially sociopaths. Because there's this whole thing where, in chapter 49 or 50 or whatever it is, where Israel is kind of talking to all his sons, and he mentions that Simeon and Levi, they abuse animals, which, according to the DSM, is a symptom of, antisocial. I'm forgetting the whole thing now. Basically, one of the major symptoms of being a sociopath is you like to harm animals. Animal abuse is a symptom of sociopath and sociopathic behavior. And so it's interesting that the Bible points this. I mean, we don't even know if in the ancient world they actually had these kind of medical conditions documented the way we do now. But it's pretty clear that the Bible writers had an idea of, these kind of mental conditions. Of course, the Bible does this thing where it just clumps like spiritual and mental conditions together, and that's part of the whole sin issue, which I know there's some pushback on that because not all mental conditions would qualify as sin per se. But I think being a sociopath definitely falls in the category of what would be kept as a sin, even if you quote unquote can't control it. Because, I mean, there's that whole argument of why mental conditions should not be viewed the same way as like how religious people view sin, because some people can't control their mental conditions. Which, I mean, that's a very touchy and controversial subject. And it has a lot of nuance to it. That's understandable. But of course, with Simeon and Levi, they're animal abusers too. So, like, is that just because of like, oh, they just can't help themselves, or are they actually like awful human beings, right? Because I mean, if you were to ask PETA, they would say, well, of course you're messed up, right? And that is your problem. You can't just chalk that away as I have a mental condition. I can't control that I hurt animals, right? That would not fly with PETA, I'll tell you that much. But of course, if you want to ask someone who's more quote unquote sympathetic to people who have mental conditions, say, well, no, they can't actually control themselves. So, too bad for the animal. A mental condition is a mental condition. So, but I mean, see, that's the problem when you try and divorce the idea of like mental conditions being mutually exclusive from like a more deeper human problem and even spiritual elements to it. Now, I know that's a hot take because like some people would say, well, you can't make that kind of statement, and I'm not a medical professional either, at least not in mental health. I have a little bit of med school education, but I was a dropout in that regard. But and that was a long time ago. But that's besides the point. But Simeon and Levi, going back to them, and these guys are very violent men. So I think that's also, the Bible puts them in center stage of this because, the Bible does mention that the other brothers were clearly in on this, right? Because there's no way you're going to tell me that two guys looted an entire town, right? Heck, it'd be hard to say that 11 guys did this, assuming Joseph would have been involved, because Joseph would have been super young, or even if he did grow up a bit. And well, this kind of like makes that weird, like, how do I put this? Because Joseph is seen as such a paragon of virtue in his story, starting in like chapter 37. Joseph is kind of shown as a paragon of virtue. Well, kind of. I mean, really, Joseph's not really a paragon of virtue till after he's sold into Egypt. So, but, it's very possible Joseph could have been involved in this conspiracy. And even then, like, 11 guys would not be enough to pillage a whole town. So obviously, like, the male servants would have gotten involved in this. Heck, you could make a good case that the female servants could have gotten involved in this because, the R word is no small matter, right? You could easily rile up, your people by saying like, well, one of our own was, R worded, and we're gonna take revenge on these guys. And I'm pretty sure everybody would have been in on this in a lot of ways, except for Jacob, because he's an old fart and kind of doesn't do anything, and is very passive in the story. But of course, Simeon and Levi are put in the center stage because they are really violent guys, and the Bible will go out of its way to kind of mention that these two are really violent. So that's one reason. I mean, that's the reason why the story puts them on center stage. For those of you that may be asking, like, well, why does it only mention Simeon and Levi? But of course, later in the book of Genesis, these two are described as animal abusers too. So there's a more than high likelihood that these guys could have been sociopathic. So yeah, the Bible is tackling these kind of issues way back then. But of course, the Bible would have done the quote unquote primitive thing and just treat it more like a holistic problem of like, It's not just mental, but it's also a spiritual problem. So that's the big thing to kind of point out here. Of course, the rest of the story is just kind of like this happened. But of course, the reason for telling chapter 34 is because chapter 35 has to happen. Where basically, in chapter 35, Israel is going to move away from Edom. Because right now they're actually kind of close to the border, but now they're going to move further into Canaan. And so, closer to where Isaac lives. And Israel's going to move a lot closer to where his dad used to live, as opposed to staying near his brother. So this story, it uses a pretty serious, well, I mean, you have to have a very serious reason to not take up your brother's offer, if you will. Because, I mean, living with Esau would not have been that bad, or living close to him anyway, would not have been that bad. But, of course, for the sake of the narrative, if you will, there has to be a pretty good reason for Israel to move away from his brother, and for them to kind of have this estranged, relationship, that they're so far away from each other. And so, unfortunately, the Bible does do what many modern people would call the woman in the refrigerator motif, which is where a female character is basically sacrificed for the purpose of the narrative. And so Dinah is unfortunately that character. She's kind of sacrificed for the sake of the story. And that's where, like, understandably, a lot of people would say, like, well, this is why the Bible's so awful, because it uses this mechanic. But, I mean, it more often than not, in society, this happens. And this is why feminism essentially exists, right? To fight against this kind of thing. Because more often than not, through history, women have been, put in the refrigerator, sort of speak. And so Dinah is no exception to this scenario, unfortunately. And unfortunately, in the Bible, we'll find other women that also get put in the refrigerator, if you will. But, of course, the Bible, when it does this, one thing to avoid is to say, well, this is why the Bible's so primitive. This is why the Bible's so awful. This is why, religion is so bad. Because it's not just the Bible that does this. A lot of other religious texts do this. I mean, modern comic books still do it to this day, right? And it's not so much that people are backward thinking, okay? That's something that people need to get out of their heads. The whole motif of women in the refrigerator is not because writers are, these old thinkers that are misogynistic, okay? That's not why, all right? The reason why the story motif exists is because it's meant to show how cruel the world is, right? That humanity is so awful and so evil that it will victimize women, right? Which, once again, the Bible's main point is that human beings are crap and only God is good. And this is a very clear example of that, yeah, woman refrigerator. It happens. And it's a very real problem. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, because I know a lot of people would be like, well, that's one reason why you shouldn't read the Bible, because it does the woman in the refrigerator. But, I mean, if you're going to be that strict, if you were to be true to that conviction that you're not going to read a book because of woman in the refrigerator, basically you wouldn't read anything. Because pretty much every form of literature has that motif show up somewhere. And sure, it's not as extreme as Dinah's case, or like in some comic books where, where the motif actually comes from. If you want the origin was actually through, I think it was a Green Lantern comic book. A little bit of history lesson of the motif. And where it got the name Woman in the Refrigerator. I think it was in a Green Lantern comic, and I think it was when Kyle Rayner. So it's actually that naming is actually pretty recent. But the idea that, like, okay, so the story goes basically, I can't remember. It was when Kyle Rayner was Green Lantern, so it was pretty recent. Like 90s recent. Whoa, I feel ancient. 90s recent. Where Kyle Rayner's girlfriend was actually cut up into pieces and then put to a refrigerator. And then, of course, he comes home and he opens the fridge and his girlfriend's dismembered in the fridge. And, the whole story arc was kind of to build up his character. So that's where the idea of the woman in the refrigerator motif, or where it got its name, rather, came from. And so the idea was that, well, this is misogynistic because it used the death of a female to move the narrative along and to build up a male character. And this is, but at the same time, I'm also making the point that, like, look, it's not just a new phenomenon. Like, the woman in the refrigerator motif has been around since basically forever, right? Because unfortunately, part of the problem of the human condition is that more often than not, we sacrifice people for some kind of narrative sake or for our personal stakes. And more often than not, those victims are women. It's just unfortunately the way it is. This is why, the battle for gender equality has been a thing, right? And so instead of viewing the motif as just like, oh, misogyny, you have to look at it as like, this is how one of the big struggles of the human condition and why human beings are not good, right? And to reject the idea that human beings are inherently good, because that's absurd, right? More often than not, we do sacrifice other people for personal gain. And the Bible does not ignore that. The Bible says, no, this is a real thing, all right? And it's a problem. And it's funny how chapter 34 ends, where Simeon and Levi actually argue that. They argue that, like, no, we won't allow our sister to be a victim, right? Which is kind of hypocritical because they literally made an entire town of victims, right? But of course, that's the other thing too, that it has to be, people need to be very careful of, right? Because it's easy to try and say, well, I justify the one, right? We try to save Dinah, but what is the cost of that too? And that's another another problem of the woman in the refrigerator motif is, how many people end up affected in the wake of the chaos made by one woman in a refrigerator, right? And so chapter 34, I have to address this story motif because it's kind of what chapter 34 is in a nutshell. It's just like the Bible's version of that motif. I mean, the Bible will definitely use it again, unfortunately. But it's just the way things were, right? It's how the real world is, unfortunately. But this is all the more reason why, why we need a savior, if you will, right? That's, the Christianese words would be, that's why you need Jesus, right? Because human beings are terrible and we will victimize others to, to move our lives forward. As terrible as that sounds, but that has been the course of history since day one. And nobody is, absolved from that guilt, right? But at the same time, you can't rely on other human beings to fix the problem, right? Because human beings won't fix the problem. It's in the human nature to use, to put people in the refrigerator just to move their own agendas along. And the Bible is no stranger to that. That's kind of how you should read this story. Don't just view it as like, oh, misogyny. But rather, it's the harsh reality. Because it's not like, oh man, why am I glowing like in the screen here? I kind of need to fix this lighting system. But let me just change this a little bit. I think part of the problem is that, like, I have this screen thing on. And when I have the screen on, like, it makes me glow a lot more. So I guess I only have the screen on when I really need it, like if I need to use the whiteboard, which oddly enough I haven't need to use it today. Well, see, now this is kind of worse. There you go. But of course, like, the other problem too is I'm using OBS, and OBS does, like, it looks different on OBS than what you actually see on YouTube. So You just gotta keep that in, I have to keep that in mind. Sorry, I'm just sidetracking here. But that's because I'm basically done chapter 34 in a nutshell. Excuse me. So, sociopathic brothers and a woman in the fridge. But at the same time, the story is clever in that it tried to, because of the existence of the woman in the fridge motif, ironically, you don't really call out Simeon and Levi for being sociopathic. In that they're willing to just slaughter a whole bunch of guys over their sister, right? Because it's not about, because, you know, the old saying, when it's a whole bunch of people, it's a statistic. But when it's one person, it's a tragedy, right? Not much to say about this chapter because the other characters aren't important. They're all dead anyway. Although you have to give points to these two sociopaths that their plan was brilliant, right? Just make all the men in that town circumcised, and then they'll be recovering from surgery, and then that's when you can just wipe them out because they'd be too weak to fight you. So, I mean, points to their brilliant plan. Even though it's awful, right? It's awful that they just went and slaughtered all these guys and took all the women and children as slaves. Because once again, there's that irony here too. Well, not as drastic an irony as with Esau, but like, once again, the Bible is not portraying the people of Israel as particularly good people. Like, these guys are pretty awful, right? If two of the tribes of Israel are founded on sociopaths, not a great how do I put it? Not, it doesn't look good. Let's just go with that. It doesn't look good. So yeah, that's chapter 34. And I know I had to explain the whole woman in the fridge thing, but I think it's something that like a lot of Christians aren't aware of that story motif because they don't read a lot of comic books to really get that. Because comic books, I think, are a huge guilty party of using the woman in the fridge motif. Because it's used like I've been reading comic books for years, and you see it happen so often. So, but that's why the motif is named that. It's named because the comic book really like got a lot more heads turning of the controversy in regards to that. And one reason why like there was all these hard bans on modern comic books, and there's a whole controversy about it. And a reason why a lot of Christians don't read comic books because of like those controversies. Understandable, but at the same time, you know, you got to understand these narrative motifs, and because they show up in so many different places. And one thing that's very dangerous is to be, you know, ignorant where it's apparent in one place, but then like make a big deal out of it somewhere else, right? Comic books is a good example of this, right? Everyone made a big deal of it when it happens in comic books, but then everybody just kind of turns a blind eye where that motif is used in other places. But I mean, no one came. I'm guessing nobody came up with that terminology back then. One, because refrigerators weren't a thing yet. But anyway, that's enough of the woman in the fridge thing. I'm gonna move on to chapter 35. Chapter 35. Then God said to Jacob, "Go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go up to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. When they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one would pursue them. Jacob and all the people with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. And there he built an altar, and he called the place El Bethel, which almost sounds redundant. It just means God of Bethel. But as we remember, a couple of chapters ago, Bethel means house of God. So it's like, God of the house of God. As opposed to, right? Like, anyway. El Bethel, because it was there that God revealed himself to Jacob when he was fleeing from his brother. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak outside of Bethel. So it was named Alon Bakuth. I think that's how you say that. Which means the tree of weeping or oak of weeping. After Jacob returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you." Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil onto it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel. Then they moved on from Bethel, while they were still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Do not despair, for you have another son." As Rachel breathed her last, she was dying. She named her son Ben-Oni. I think that's how you say that. Or is it Oni? I think it's Ben-Oni. See, like my Asian Tourette's was like Oni. But then I think it's actually pronounced Oni. So Ben-Oni. But his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Israel moved on again and pitched his tent beyond Migdal Eder. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. Now Jacob had 12 sons. The sons of Leah were Reuben the firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Rachel's servant Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Leah's servant Zilpah, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. Now Jacob came home to his father Isaac in Mamre, near Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed. Isaac lived 180 years. Then he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, old and full of years, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Okay, so yeah, that's the end of chapter 35. Now, chapter 35 just kind of tells like the transitioning story of, well, first of all, I'd use chapter 34 to say, okay, Jacob had to move out. of Sukkoth, all these places with, interesting names to say the least. So Israel slash Jacob had to move out, and he moves to basically where Isaac was living. And oddly enough, Isaac is still alive at 180 years old, because for some reason these guys just get to live super duper long. But of course, after a family reunion, it's like, okay, I can die in peace, I guess. Which is usually the expression. Which is probably why, Isaac lived so long. He probably really wanted to see Israel one last time. And then was like, okay, I can die in peace now. Like, that will no longer trouble me. Which really shows a wonder. Like, wouldn't worrying about that and having that trouble you cause you enough stress to die earlier? Like, it's, well, whatever. I'm just thinking out loud there. But basically, Isaac lived long enough to see his son one last time. Now, another thing that's kind of, it's like, one reason why I kind of treat chapter 35 as this transitional story is because it also just it just brings up stuff that has already happened, right? So there's the whole part where God renames Jacob as Israel. Now, the Bible's not 100% clear. Although, I mean, you can easily argue both ways and not really get to any real conclusion, because it's the result that matters. And that is whether, is the story referring back to chapter 32? Or is this a second time God meets with Jacob and says, hey, your name is Israel now? Does it really matter? It doesn't. You can easily argue both ways. And then, of course, there's the whole thing with like Jacob and Bethel, right? Because Bethel isn't a city yet. So, Jacob just goes to this place and calls it Bethel. And then during these events, he buries his wife's like a maid, because he's got a bunch of those now, with all the female servants he's taken, if you will. And so stuff happens at Bethel, and then of course he moves all the way to, let me check where it is again, where Isaac was living. Kiriath Arba, that's the place. I'm like, what's this place called again? Kiriath Arba, or later Hebron. Because that's why the Bible does that, where it's like, this place is actually called Hebron, or whatever. Because, of course, when the stories were edited, if you will, they would have used these ancient names because that's what the stories would have used. But then, of course, for our quote-unquote more modern audience, whether you're talking about like the Israelites moving into Canaan after Egypt, or even the Israelites post-Babylon, doesn't really matter. But obviously, these places would have had the modern names, Hebron being one of them. But of course, that's why even in the the translations always use like parentheses for this. If you actually, if you look at it yourself, you'll see that. And it's like, well, the Kiriath Arba is, this place is Hebron. Because of more modern editions. But of course, for the sake of the storytelling, they would have kept the ancient names that would have been kept when they retold the story. So it's kind of weird that the Bible does this, but it's just kind of how you rate anything that's been around for so long. And you have to make some modifications according to, cities get their names changed, especially after very long periods of time. So just wanted to point that out. But basically, the reason why I pointed that out was because basically Israel he moves all the way back to Kiriath Arba, or Hebron. And then, of course, this chapter also has the death of Rachel. So it's kind of ironic because the Bible likes doing that, where like the favorite wife gets the short end of the stick, and maybe it's a lesson to Jacob to. Well, ironically, it has the opposite effect, but maybe it was meant to teach Jacob, like, maybe you should appreciate your other wives a little bit better. But of course, there's actually the death of Rachel once again. Not as serious a case, and this is where like why the woman in the fridge thing. I can't believe I have to come back to this. In some cases, you don't really view it as that motif, but if you were to ask some people, every time a woman is used to push the story is always a case of that. Not necessarily true. But Rachel's death is actually important to a later part of the story. And it makes some things like easy to explain. And so I'll obviously bring this up again because once again we don't see the main reasoning for why Rachel's death has to be written down. But later when we get to chapter 37, which is the beginning of the Joseph story, you gotta see where I'm going with this. Joseph is clearly the favorite. And I think the main reason for that, well, not even Joseph, like you go even further in Genesis and Benjamin is Joseph's replacement as the favorite. But clearly, not only are they the children of the wife Israel loved, but because Rachel dies, and he loses his, the wife he loved, then obviously he's going to be that much more protective of his sons from his, his favorite wife, if you will. And Israel's going to be way more protective of them. At least extremely in the case of Benjamin, he's like super protective. But then of course, the Joseph story, and we'll talk about this next week when I start reading the Joseph story, because it's really long. Joseph is picked as the favorite, and I think Rachel's death has, well, I don't think, like it's pretty obvious that Rachel's death has a lot to do with that. Because he wants to, keep that love he has for his favorite wife. And so he favors the kids that he had with her. Of course, this ends up shooting him in the foot. But of course, there's like the whole like blessing in disguise thing, and Joseph himself will say it that God can use evil things for good. But in a short-term perspective, like Israel shoots himself in the foot by doing this, right? By choosing Joseph as the favorite, and blatantly so, especially after Rachel dies. And so that's a big reason why the Bible actually goes out of its way to talk about like Rachel dying and the birth of Benjamin in this fashion, because it really basically it just gives the clear explanation. If you can't put two and two together, you have some serious literary problems, like literary skill problems or grammar problems, I guess you could say, if you can't put two and two together. But of course, Rachel's death shows so much of why Israel behaves in certain ways in regard to Joseph and later Benjamin, or Ben-Oni. Which, by the way, Ben-Oni sounds like a way better name than Benjamin. But, of course, Benjamin is way easier to say. So, anything else that happens in this chapter? Not really. There's the whole Israel thing again, but I've already talked about that in great length. And of course, Esau and Jacob clearly have buried the hatchet along with their dad, because they just meet together and they just bury the old guy after he dies. And so, for Jacob to return home kind of ends the story arc for him, and that he's found his place. But of course, his place is ultimately to have a people and their identity tied with God. And I think that's why chapter 35 kind of retells, God renaming Jacob as Israel. Because that is the centerpiece of which God is going to carry out the covenant throughout Israel's history, right? And why God ties himself so much with them and why they're the chosen people and all that. All right, it is 5:15. I'm doing way better on time than I thought. So I'm going to read through chapter 36. And this one, it's really just a lot of text because I have to read a genealogy, which I know is going to be super boring for you as the audience. So, you can take this time to also like muster some questions or, things you want me to clarify in earlier parts. But I'm just giving you that forewarning now, so please don't fall asleep because, I mean, me reading, you gotta imagine how hard it is for me to read through this, especially reading it out loud. So, brace yourselves for chapter 36, which is the last chapter we will be reading for today. Chapter 36. So this is the account of the family line of Esau, that is Edom. So Esau took his wives from the women of Canaan, Ada, daughter of Elon the Hittite, and how the hell do you say this? Oholibama, daughter of Anah, the granddaughter of Zibeon the Hivite. Also Basemath, daughter of Ishmael and sister of Nebaioth. Ada bore Eliphaz to Esau, Basemath bore Reuel, and Oholibama bore Jeush, Jalem, and Korah. And these were the sons of Esau who were born to him in Canaan. Now Esau took his wives and sons and daughters and all the members of his household, as well as his livestock and all other animals and all the goods he had acquired in Canaan, and moved to a land some distance from his brother Jacob. Their possessions were too great for them to remain together, and the land where they were staying could not support them both. So because of their livestock, Esau, that is Edom, settled in the hill country of Seir. This is the account of the family line of Esau, the father of the Edomites in the hill country of Seir. These are the names of Esau's sons. Eliphaz, the son of Esau's wife Ada, Reuel, the son of Esau's wife Basemath. I know that's not how you say it. The son of Eliphaz, Teman, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. Esau's son Eliphaz also had a concubine named Timnah, who bore him Amalek. And these were the grandsons of Esau's wife Ada. Now the sons of Reuel, they hath Zerah, Shammah, and Mizhah. And these were the grandsons of Esau's wife Basemath. The sons of Esau's wife Oholibama, daughter of Anah, the granddaughter of Zibeon, whom she bore to Esau, Jeush, Jalem, and Korah. Oh, that's just one part. Jesus' part is long. Now, verse 15. These were the chiefs among Esau's descendants, the sons of Eliphaz, the firstborn of Esau, chiefs Teman, Omar, Zepho, Kenaz, Korah, Gatam, and Amalek. And these were the chief descendants from Eliphaz and Edom, and they were the grandsons of Ada. I mean, you guys literally just said this. The sons of Reuel, chief Nahath, Zerah, Shammah, and Mizah. These were the chiefs descended from Reuel and Edom. They were grandsons of Basemath. The sons of Oholibama, chief Jeush, Jalem, and Korah. And these were the chiefs descended from Esau's wife Oholibama, daughter of Anah. And these were the sons of Esau, that is Edom, and these were their chiefs. Oh, that's a mouthful and a lot of repetition. These were the sons of Seir, the Horite, who were living in the region: Lotan, Shobal, Zibeon, Ana, Dishan, Ezer, and Dishon. Now these sons of Seir and Edom were Horite chiefs. And the sons of Lotan were Ori and Homan. Timnah was Lotan's sister. Now the sons of Shobal, Alvan, wow, that guy is like the most regular name. Alvan, Manahath, Ebal, Shepho, or I think it is Shepho? Shepho and Onam. Now the sons of Zibeon, Aya and Ana. And this is the Ana who discovered the hot springs in the desert while he was grazing the donkeys of his father Zibeon. The children of Ana, Dishan and Oholibama, what? Another Oholibama, because now there's two of them. Daughter of Ana. Sons of Dishan, Hemdan, Eshban, Ithron, and Kiran. The sons of Ezer, Bilhan, Zavan, and Achan. The sons of Dishon, Uz and Aran. Okay, that guy has the most regular name. Aran. These were the Horite chiefs: Lotan, Shobal, Zibeon, Ana, Dishan, Ezer, and Dishon. That can get really confusing. Because these two guys have like almost the same name. It's just an O and an A. That's literally the difference between their names. These were the Horite chiefs according to their divisions in the land of Seir. Verse 31. Now these were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. Bela, son of Beor, became king of Edom. His city was named Dihabah. When Bela died, Jobab, son of Zerah from Bozrath, succeeded him as king. When Jobab died, Husham from the land of the Temanites succeeded him as king. When Husham died, Hadad, son of Bedad, who defeated Midian in the country of Moab, succeeded him as king. His city was named Avith. When Hadad died, Samlah from Mashrika succeeded him as king. When Samlah died, Shaul from Rehoboth on the river succeeded him as king. When Shaul died, Baal-Hanan son of Akbor succeeded him as king. And when Baal-Hanan son of Akbor died, Hadad succeeded him as king. And his city was named Pau. And his wife's name was Mehetabel? Yeah, Mehetabel, daughter of Matred, the daughter of Mizahab. These are the chiefs descended from Esau by name, according to their clans and regions: Timnah, Alva, Jethath, Oholibama, Elah, Pinon, Kenaz, Timon, Mibzar, Magdiel, and Imram. These were the chiefs of Edom according to their settlements in the lands that they occupied. This is the family line of Esau, the father of the Edomites. Boy howdy, that was a lot to read, and I don't have a lot to say about it, because it's basically just saying, here's Esau's family, and they were a massive people group. And that's basically the real point you need from that chapter, because there's not much else to say. Basically what I think the Bible was getting at when doing this whole Esau genealogy is, one, how the Edomites could still be around 400 years later and weren't wiped out like a lot of other people groups were. So there was like an obvious family lineage that they had. And secondly, the theological answer would be that, God still blessed and provided for Esau, despite the fact that Jacob stole that blessing, right? So Esau clearly had a long family line, and, that continued on. Other than that, I really have nothing to say about the whole Esau line, because that was a lot of hard names that I'm not going to bother reading again. Definitely not on stream anyway. And probably not out loud, because I like to see a pastor make a sermon on just the genealogy part. You churchgoers probably have like, I've never heard a sermon done on chapter 36, and for good reasons. I mean, you heard me struggle through all those names. Oh, but aside from that, and jokes aside, not much else to really say about this chapter. It's just meant to kind of show how, God allowed Esau to be prosperous, despite the fact that Jacob had stolen it. Nothing else to really say about it. No other comments. So with that being said, I know I kind of rushed that last part, but it's always a dread to read genealogy parts, because it's just like you're just reading all these hard to pronounce names, especially in Genesis, right? Because you have all these funky names from these civilizations long since gone, and now we as modern people, for good reason, use way simpler names. Because I mean, just imagine like little girls being named Holibama. Now that I think about it, that is actually a cool sounding name. At least when I say it that way, anyways. It's probably not how it's actually pronounced. But I mean, I can understand why people don't use these names, because man, they are tongue twisters. Especially when you have to deal with whole families, right? But anyway, that is the end of the Jacob/Israel arc, and the end of his whimsical adventures. Next week, or next Friday, I will start with the Joseph story arc. So, and that's Joseph is a character that people are much more familiar with, because of the whole. Well, there was an animated movie based on the Joseph story. There's been a lot of movies actually based on the Joseph story. He's way more interesting to talk about in anyway. But so next Friday we'll start the Joseph series, if you will. So I hope you enjoyed, the Jacob arc. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So next week, at least 4 days of streaming. I'll see if I do Monday. I don't know if I'll do Monday, but a regular week would be Tuesday, Wednesday with Tokyo Mirage. And then Thursday will be Throwback Thursday. Friday will be reading stream. That's kind of the basic schedule for the rest of November. Unless Taki gets back to me and we do some Silent Hill, which I would like to do. One, because I kind of want to finish Silent Hill, and it's like keeping me a little bit on edge that I'm like, oh, it's not done. Must finish. But I'll try and contact Taki. I know he's busy, especially like, college students in November. It can be super stressful. And I get that. I mean, I used to be one for like 9 years. It's a long time to be in school. But I'll try and see if Taki's down for some Silent Hill. And if he is, that will warp like how often I do Tokyo Mirage. Because I also want to finish that game for you guys before December. Probably not going to happen though. Because like November only really has like one more week. Yeah, November really only has one more week. And then December is going to start. So when December comes around, I kind of want to do something a little bit different. But I will keep you posted on what those are as we reach the end of November. So basically next week in November, I will talk about some projects in December. Of course, I will, little hints, I do need to coordinate a fair amount with what I want to do for December. So, keep your ears peeled for when I come up with that. Keep your eyes and ears peeled. But as far as next week is concerned, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Thursday, Friday is pretty consistent. It'll just be more Brood War and more Genesis. But we'll see what I do in the other days of the week. If Taki's around, we'll do some Silent Hill. If he's not, it'll just be more Tokyo Mirage next week. So I hope you guys will tune into those. With that being said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed me reading through the rest of the Jacob/Israel story. And I hope you guys will tune in for streams next week. And I will see you then. You have a good night, a good weekend, and God bless you.